The explosion shattered the stillness of the morning, ripping through the air with a deafening crack. I hadn't even taken my first sip of coffee when I heard the sound of destruction. Racing out the door, I barely had time to process the chaos. My family's century-old stone dam, a symbol of resilience, was crumbling under the weight of explosives. The jagged chunks of hand-cut limestone flew into the air, the pond's calm surface now shattered by the shockwave. And there she stood, Karen Hawthorne, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. The HOA president, always in control, always on top, was casually brushing dust off her pristine polo shirt, acting as if she'd just done the neighborhood a favor. "Free demolition," she quipped with a smirk. "Your little swamp was killing our property values." What she didn't realize, what no one saw, was that swamp had been protecting this whole neighborhood from floods for over a century. And now, she'd just pulled the plug on a ticking time bomb. The spring snowmelt was only 6 weeks away, and the very dam she destroyed had been holding back waters that could flood the entire community. The acrid scent of explosives still hung in the air as Karen snapped selfies in front of the wreckage, completely oblivious to the disaster she'd just set into motion. She thought she'd won, but in reality she'd just turned her $800K McMansion into future lakefront property, Old Testament style. What would you do if someone destroyed your family's legacy and then posted smug selfies about it? Drop your worst HOA horror story in the comments. This one's about to go full biblical. Karen Hawthorne had been the HOA president for 8 years, and she made it clear she thought she owned the entire neighborhood. Every time I saw her strutting around in her perfectly pressed khakis and that overpriced polo, it was like she was reminding everyone that she was in charge. She wasn't just the head of the HOA, she was the queen of Millbrook Estates, and she ran it like her personal kingdom. Her vision for the neighborhood, a pristine cookie-cutter resort community where everything was manicured and perfect. She wanted golf courses, spas, and homes that looked like they came straight out of a luxury magazine. My family's land, with its old stone dam and natural pond, didn't fit into that picture. To her, it was nothing more than a lily-pad ruining the aesthetic of her dream development. And the worst part, I hadn't even agreed to be part of her HOA. My family's land had been here long before the association was formed, and we'd always stayed outside of it. But Karen didn't care about history or boundaries. She saw something she wanted, and that was all that mattered. So, when the certified letter arrived thick with legal threats and demands for $12, 0 inches, bogus HOA fees, I knew it wasn't just about money, it was about power. And that's when Karen showed her true colors. "Ezra, you're behind on your HOA assessments," she said, her voice dripping with condescension over the phone. "And that dam of yours, it's a violation of community standards. You have 30 days to take it down." I could feel my blood boil. There was no basis for her claims, no agreement, no valid reason, nothing. But to Karen, rules only applied when they suited her. The HOA wasn't about community standards. It was about control. She wanted my land, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The letter wasn't just the beginning of a legal battle. It was the opening salvo in a campaign of harassment that would leave me questioning how far Karen and her HOA were willing to go. I figured it was just a bad first move. Surely once I showed her that my family had never joined the HOA, she'd back off. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. She had a vision of what Millbrook Estates should look like, and I was becoming the last obstacle standing between her and that vision. A few days after the letter, I found a strange car parked in front of my property. It was parked on the gravel shoulder, just a little too close to my driveway, and there was a woman sitting inside her face, partially obscured by tinted windows. At first I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a neighbor or someone passing by. But when I saw Karen's car pulling away from the same spot later that afternoon, I started to get suspicious. She had been driving around scoping out my property, and that wasn't the first time. The next morning I found a folded piece of paper stuck under my front door. It was an official-looking notice of violation from the HOA. I stared at it, reading the words over and over, as if they might change. The violation, excessive weed growth along the western fence line. The description was vague, just a generic weeds written in block letters. I knew what this was, a thinly veiled excuse for her to flex her power over me. There were a few dandelions and wildflowers growing along the fence, nothing more. But to Karen, everything had to be perfect, every inch of lawn, every blade of grass in the right place. I called her immediately, hoping to resolve this, like reasonable adults. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we both know this is just a few wildflowers. I've lived here for years, and no one has ever cared about the weeds." Her response was cold, almost amused. "Ezra, we have standards here. You're part of the community, whether you like it or not. And those weeds aren't up to standard." Her words lingered in the air like a threat, And sure enough, the very next morning, I found another notice of violation on my doorstep. This time, it was for the height of my fence. Apparently, it was too tall for community aesthetic standards. I had put up that fence years ago after the previous owner's cows had wandered onto my land, but now it was an issue. That afternoon, I bumped into Bill, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down. He awkwardly avoided eye contact when I asked him about the car that had been parked by my house the day before. "She's been going door to door," Bill mumbled, "getting people to report violations. Took photos of your front yard, too. Can't say I agree with it, but she's serious about enforcing those rules." It hit me then, this wasn't just about aesthetics or community standards. Karen was using her position as HOA president to target me, to bend me to her will. And she wasn't shy about getting others involved in her crusade. The final straw came the following week, when Rick Morrison, the county building inspector, showed up at my door. He was a big guy with a clipboard, an old buddy of Karen's from her golf group, and he looked like he was enjoying himself. "Got a complaint about your fence height," he said, tapping his pen on his clipboard. "Gonna need to inspect it for code compliance." I hadn't touched my fence in years. It was solid, sturdy, and well within legal limits. But I knew this was no coincidence. Karen had pulled some strings, used her connections to make sure I had to deal with this. I stood there trying to keep my cool, as Morrison walked around measuring and jotting down notes, clearly just going through the motions. "I've already been through this with Karen," I said, hoping to get some resolution. He gave me a half-hearted shrug like he didn't care about the details. "You'll get a report," he said, walking off like this was just another routine inspection. 2 weeks after the county inspector left my property, the harassment shifted into overdrive. It was no longer just about dandelions or fence height. It was clear Karen was trying to bully me into submission. Every few days, another notice of violation would arrive, each more absurd than the last. Unapproved mailbox design, unauthorized decorative lighting, failure to maintain shrubbery along the property line. It was as if Karen had hired an army of invisible eyes to monitor every inch of my land, and every time I turned around, she found a new reason to report me. But it wasn't just the constant barrage of paperwork, it was the tone. Karen's letters were dripping with condescension, as though she thought she could break me with bureaucracy. Every notice made it clear that I was the problem, that my property, my choices, were somehow offensive to the community she was protecting. Then came the first official visit from the HOA board. I was sitting on my porch trying to make sense of the latest violation when the sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Karen wearing a smile that made her look like a lion, about to devour a wounded animal. She was accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, short, mid-40s, wearing a dark suit carrying a briefcase. His demeanor was stiff, businesslike. "Ezra, this is Bill Simmons," Karen said, her voice sugary sweet, but I could hear the underlying edge. "He's the HOA's legal consultant. I think it's time we had a little chat about your property's compliance issues." I stood up, trying to maintain my composure, but it wasn't easy. This wasn't a friendly chat. It was clear Karen was trying to force me into a corner, to make me feel small, to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. She didn't even have the decency to call first. Just showed up unannounced, sending a clear message that my rights didn't matter. "We've reviewed your property," Bill Simmons said, flipping through his briefcase and pulling out a thick packet of papers, "and we've come to the conclusion that your dam violates several key community standards, including water management and aesthetics." My heart sank. I couldn't believe it. They were going after the dam now. This wasn't just about me. This was about my family's legacy. I opened my mouth to speak, but Karen cut me off, her voice almost too sweet. "Ezra," she said with a cold smile, "you've been given plenty of time to comply with the HOA's regulations, but it seems you're unwilling to cooperate. The next step, unfortunately, is to issue fines for non-compliance, starting at $500 a day. If you don't remove that eyesore within 30 days, we'll escalate things." I blinked in disbelief. "You want me to tear down my family's dam? You've got to be kidding me." Karen tilted her head, as if I were being difficult for no reason. "This isn't personal, Ezra. It's about maintaining the integrity of the community. We have standards to uphold, and your dam is a liability to those standards." Her words were calculated, as if she were reading from a script, carefully rehearsed to make sure she sounded reasonable, while slowly suffocating my ability to fight back. The moment they left, I stood in the driveway, staring at the spot where the SUV had been parked. Fines, escalation, the dam. It was all part of her plan. I had no doubt now. This wasn't about minor infractions or keeping up appearances. This was a power play, pure and simple. Karen wanted my land, and she was willing to bulldoze me and my family's history to get it. I spent the next few hours going through the legal records I had on hand, digging through my grandfather's paperwork. I needed something, anything that could prove we were exempt from this nonsense. By the time night fell, I found a key piece of information, a legal loophole Karen hadn't counted on. My family had specifically refused HOA membership when it was formed, and there was a long-standing ambiguity in the property boundaries in county records. That meant I had a solid case to challenge this, if I could gather the right evidence, if I could get the right people on my side. But Karen wasn't done. As I was making my plans, I saw the familiar black SUV roll back into my driveway the next day. The pressure was escalating, and Karen, with her smile and cold demeanor, wasn't going to stop until she broke me. Things had gone from bad to worse in the span of a few weeks. The constant barrage of fines, notices, and ridiculous complaints about my property had started to feel like one long, bad dream. But when Karen went after my family's dam, that was when I realized just how far she was willing to go. This wasn't about property aesthetics or neighborhood standards anymore. This was personal. My great-grandfather's dam, a testament to hard work and ingenuity, was now in her sights, and if she had her way, she'd destroy it. It started with an innocent enough phone call. I was sitting at my kitchen table one quiet morning, trying to figure out the next steps in my legal battle with Karen. My lawyer, Rebecca, had made it clear we had a solid case, but I knew it would take time. As I sat there, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked it up anyway. Mr. Blackwood, the voice on the other end said, and I immediately recognized it as Rick Morrison, the county building inspector. I've received an official request from the HOA to conduct a safety inspection of your dam. They're concerned about its structural integrity. I nearly dropped my coffee. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. My dam is fine. It's been standing for nearly a century. I'm just doing my job, Ezra Rick replied. The HOA's filed an official complaint. I'll be out to inspect it this afternoon. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen wasn't playing games anymore. She was going after the heart of my family's land. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Why now? Why after everything we'd been through? What kind of twisted move was this? I wasn't naive. I knew it was part of Karen's plan to wear me down, but this was something different. This wasn't about fines. This was a direct attack on my family's legacy. When Rick arrived later that day, I watched him step out of his truck, clipboard in hand. He didn't look at me when he walked past. Instead, he went straight to the dam, inspecting it like it was just another routine job. I could see the glint in his eyes, the way he was just going through the motions, no real interest in what was there, just the job at hand. Everything looks fine, I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. This is the same dam that's been here for decades. It's standing strong. Rick didn't respond. He just tapped his pen against his clipboard, scribbling notes. He walked around the structure, tapping at the stones with his pen, like he was testing the strength of a used car. He didn't take any measurements, didn't take any photographs, he just inspected. By the time he finished, I could tell he had already made up his mind. He was just waiting to write the report. I'll send my assessment over in a few days, Rick muttered, not meeting my eye. I'll be in touch. That was it. He left without saying anything else. But I knew exactly what was coming. He had been paid to do this. Paid to check off the boxes, to give Karen what she wanted. And it didn't matter that the dam was safe, that it had weathered storms and floods for nearly 100 years. All that mattered was Karen's vision for the future, and my family's history didn't fit into that picture. Sure enough, the report came the next morning. The words on the page were a direct contradiction of everything I knew to be true about the dam. According to Rick, my dam was in imminent danger of collapse. The report cited structural failure and erosion that was typical of older, poorly constructed dams. It was a slap in the face, and it was pure fiction. My great-grandfather had built the dam with his own hands, using hand-cut limestone that had stood the test of time. He didn't need fancy modern techniques. He just needed skill and care, two things that had been passed down in our family. I felt my blood boil as I read through the report. I could almost hear Karen's smug voice in my head, knowing she had orchestrated every single word of this. And now, she was using the system to try to tear down a piece of my family's legacy. The report went on to demand immediate demolition of the dam, claiming that failure to do so would result in severe legal consequences. I couldn't believe it. Demolition. This wasn't a simple nuisance. This was a direct attack on my property. This was a legal bulldozer aimed at my family's history. And if Karen had her way, my great-grandfather's work would be erased forever. I called my lawyer Rebecca immediately. This is bullshit, I said, pacing the floor. They're trying to destroy my dam with a completely fabricated report. We need to fight this. Rebecca's voice was calm but firm. I agree. But we're going to need more than just your word. You need to hire an independent inspector, someone with the credibility to prove that the dam is safe. I didn't need much convincing. I immediately called Matthews and Associates, one of the top structural engineering firms in the state. I knew it was going to cost a small fortune, but I didn't care. I had to protect my family's history. I had to fight back. 2 weeks later, the team from Matthews arrived. The lead engineer, Mike, was a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in structural engineering. He didn't seem fazed by the task at hand. He knew exactly what he was looking at when he approached the dam. Mike and his team spent 6 hours carefully inspecting the entire structure. They took measurements, tested the mortar joints, and analyzed the water flow. They even brought in equipment that I could barely pronounce, equipment I knew cost more than my truck. It wasn't just an inspection, it was a full forensic analysis of the dam's integrity. By the time they finished, Mike had a smile on his face. "You're right," he said, handing me the final report. "This dam exceeds current safety standards by 200%. Your great-grandfather's design is actually superior to many modern-day structures. In fact, with regular maintenance, this dam could easily last another 500 years. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. This wasn't just good news, it was the ammunition I needed. With Mike's report in hand, I had the perfect counter to Karen's fabricated claims. Now all I needed to do was get the word out. I wasn't about to let Karen destroy my family's history, and I wasn't about to let her get away with manipulating the system. But I also knew that Karen wouldn't just walk away. This fight was far from over, and she wasn't going to back down easily. I had the evidence, but now it was time to make her pay for what she had done. With the independent inspection report in hand, I thought I had enough to take on Karen and her HOA. But I quickly realized this wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was a war. And the next escalation came in the form of local authorities. Karen had pulled out all the stops, and it seemed like she had every angle covered. The first visit from the authorities came a few days after I received Mike's report. It wasn't from the county building inspector this time, it was from a completely different department. I was sitting in the living room still going through paperwork when there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find a sheriff's deputy standing in front of me, clipboard in hand. Behind him, a man in a suit who I didn't recognize was standing with his arms crossed. "Mr. Blackwood," the deputy asked, his tone stiff and formal. "I'm Deputy Thompson with the County Sheriff's Office. This is John Hargrove, an inspector with the Colorado Department of Environmental Protection. We've received a complaint about your property and the potential environmental hazards it poses." I didn't even try to hide my confusion. Environmental hazards. My property is 100 years old. There's nothing hazardous about it. "Can we step inside?" Hargrove asked. It wasn't a question, it was an order. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and let them in. The deputy took a seat by the door while Hargrove walked around the room, clearly inspecting everything. I watched him as he opened the curtains, looked out the windows, and took note of everything in sight. He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the tension building in the room. "Mr. Blackwood," Hargrove said, his voice cold, "we've been notified that your dam may be creating an environmental hazard in violation of state water management laws. There are concerns about water contamination, as well as the potential for erosion. We're here to conduct a formal inspection." "Water contamination," I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "My pond is the cleanest thing in this county. My family has been managing it for generations without any issue. You're telling me this is an environmental concern, just doing my job, mister?" Blackwood, Hargrove said dismissively, clearly unbothered by my frustration. He continued walking around the room, pulling out his clipboard and taking notes, ignoring everything I was saying. It wasn't until Hargrove asked to inspect the dam itself that I realized this was more than just a random inspection. This was orchestrated. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. She had found yet another way to attack me, this time through government agencies and the legal system. I led them down to the dam, my blood boiling, as I watched Hargrove inspect the very structure that had stood for nearly a century. The whole time he barely looked at the actual dam, just walked around it, scribbling down notes as if trying to find something, anything, to justify Karen's accusations. His eyes were locked on the land around it, as if searching for something to report back. "I'll have a full report for you in a few days," Hargrove finally said, his tone neutral. "But based on my preliminary observations, I believe there's a strong case that your dam is in violation of state environmental regulations." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. Karen had turned every official system against me, using her influence to manipulate authorities into doing her bidding. It was like she had weaponized the law to make sure I lost. The deputy just stood by, silent, offering no help. But I knew what I had to do. Karen and her cronies weren't going to stop here. I had to fight back, and I had to do it in a way that would get their attention. The moment the inspectors left, I called Rebecca, and we immediately went over our next steps. It was clear I wasn't going to get any help from local authorities. They were already compromised. So I decided to take the next logical step. I needed to go higher. I contacted the state's engineering board and sent them everything I had: the independent inspection report from Matthews and Associates, photos of the dam, and the detailed records of my family's history with the property. I also called in a favor from a former colleague of mine who worked in the state's environmental agency. I needed every ally I could get because Karen wasn't playing fair. A week later, I got a response from the state engineering board. They had reviewed the documentation, and they were opening an investigation into the county's involvement in Karen's attacks. The state had no tolerance for corruption or illegal actions that endangered public safety. They were sending an investigator to review Hargrove's report and Rick Morrison's inspection. But it wasn't just the state that was starting to take notice. Word started to spread through the neighborhood that Karen and her cronies were abusing their positions of power. Some of the other neighbors who had been silent before began to speak up, voicing concerns about the HOA's lack of transparency and the financial irregularities that had started to surface. One evening, after another tense meeting with Rebecca, I was walking out to my truck when I saw Bill from down the street. He was walking toward me, his face tense. "I've heard things," Ezra, Bill said, his voice low. "There's talk among the neighbors. People are starting to ask questions about what Karen's really doing with their HOA dues. They're starting to see her for what she is." It felt like a small victory. The more people saw through Karen's act, the more support I had. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. A few days later, I got an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was muffled, but I could tell it was one of her people. "We've got a plan to take your dam down once and for all. Get ready for the storm." The call ended abruptly, leaving me standing in the driveway, a cold sweat running down my back. I knew I was running out of time. I had to stop Karen before she could destroy everything my family had worked for. The legal systems were tangled, the authorities were compromised, and now it was up to me to take control of the narrative. It was time to turn the tide, and I would do whatever it took to save my family's legacy. I knew it was coming. After everything I'd been through, after the constant barrage of false accusations, the fabricated reports, and the steady buildup of Karen's attacks, I realized I had no choice. This wasn't just about saving my family's dam anymore. It was about exposing Karen for the corrupt, manipulative person she truly was, and making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. The tipping point came when I received a formal letter from Karen's lawyers. I had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier to read. The letter demanded that I vacate my property immediately or face further legal action from the HOA. The legalese was thick and threatening, but there was one sentence in it that stood out like a red flag. "If you do not remove the dam by the date stated, we will begin eminent domain proceedings to seize your land for the safety of the community." I sat back in my chair, stunned. Eminent domain. Karen was resorting to using the government's power to steal my property. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was a full-scale attack, and she wasn't going to stop until she had my land under her control. I called Rebecca immediately. "This is it," I said, my voice tight with anger. "She's trying to take my property. She's using eminent domain." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing. "This is what we've been waiting for, Ezra. We have the evidence now, but we need to act fast. You have a limited window to challenge her, and you need to make sure that this isn't just a legal battle, it's a public one." Rebecca was right. It was time to stop hiding in the shadows and fight back, not just in court, but in the public eye. I wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. If I had to take this fight to the streets, to the press, to every neighbor who'd ever doubted me, so be it. The next day I called an emergency meeting of Millbrook Estates homeowners. I wasn't about to stand idly by while Karen stripped me of everything. I needed the support of the people who were starting to realize how deep her corruption ran. The meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on a Friday, and by the time I arrived, the community center was packed. I hadn't seen this many people in one place since the annual HOA barbecue. The room was thick with tension, and I could feel it in my bones. This was it. I either succeeded tonight or I'd lose everything. As I walked to the front of the room, I could see the familiar faces of the people I'd known for years, Bill, Janet, and others who had seen the creeping corruption in Karen's leadership. There were murmurs as I took the stage, but I didn't waste time. This wasn't a time for pleasantries. I needed them to understand what was at stake. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice calm but firm, "I know you've all been living under the shadow of Karen's HOA for far too long. I know that many of you have quietly questioned where your dues have gone, why our community has been under constant attack, and why your property values are dropping despite your best efforts to maintain them. There were nods and mutters of agreement. I've been fighting this battle for months, I continued, but it's no longer just about fines or weeds or mailbox heights. Karen Hawthorne, the president of our HOA, is trying to seize my property through eminent domain. She's using the government to take my land, my family's land, so she can destroy a century-old dam that's protected this entire community from flooding for generations. The room went silent. The shock on everyone's faces was palpable, but I knew this was the moment they'd all been waiting for the truth. I have all the proof, I said, pulling out the stack of documents I had prepared. Karen has been manipulating the system. She's been filing false reports with inspectors, bribing officials, and using her power to line her pockets. And now she's using eminent domain to try and take my property for a development scheme that'll line her pockets and leave this community vulnerable to floods. I paused to let the words sink in. There was a collective gasp as people realized the depth of Karen's corruption. But it gets worse, I said, raising my voice. I've got evidence that proves she's been embezzling HOA funds to finance her development projects. I held up the stack of financial documents. This is the proof that Karen Hawthorne has been stealing from every single one of you. This is the proof that she's been using your money to fund her personal gain. The room erupted in chaos. People stood up, shouting, some pointing fingers, others demanding answers. I held up my hand to calm them down. I know you're angry. You have every right to be, I said, but we can't let this go on any longer. We need to stand together and fight back. If we don't, Karen will destroy everything. But we have the power to stop her. Together we can make sure that Karen faces the consequences of her actions. We can make sure this community is protected from her greed. I could see the shift in the room. People were no longer just angry, they were motivated. Janet Morrison, one of the few who had always kept a level head, stood up, her voice strong. I move that we remove Karen Hawthorne from all HOA positions immediately and freeze all community financial accounts pending a full audit, she said, her eyes flashing with determination. The room erupted in cheers, and a dozen others stood to second the motion. By the end of the night, the vote was unanimous. Karen Hawthorne was no longer the president of the HOA. Her power was gone, but the real battle wasn't over yet. As the crowd began to disperse, I looked around the room. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, but I still had one more card to play. It was time to take her down. The next day, I reached out to the local news station, Channel 9. I had everything: proof of embezzlement, the forged reports, and Karen's blatant manipulation of the legal system. It was time for the public to see her for who she truly was. By the time the sun set, the story was already breaking. Channel 9 was covering the scandal, and the media was starting to take notice. Karen's empire was crumbling. But Karen, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. The following morning, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. She showed up at the local council meeting with her lawyer, demanding that the council approve her eminent domain request, despite her removal from office. But she wasn't prepared for the evidence I had. I walked into that meeting with my folder of documents, ready to expose every lie she'd ever told. And when it was my turn to speak, I made sure the room knew exactly who Karen Hawthorne really was. By the time the council voted, Karen's petition for eminent domain was dead in the water. The vote was unanimous. Karen had lost. She had manipulated the system, stolen from her neighbors, and tried to destroy my family's legacy, and now she was facing the consequences. But the biggest blow came when the federal investigation into her actions was launched. The Department of Justice was looking into her embezzlement fraud and the illegal destruction of authorized infrastructure. Karen Hawthorne was going down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The council chamber was packed when I walked in. The hum of conversation stopped as I stepped forward carrying a large folder stuffed with evidence. The room was a mix of emotions, some curious, some cautious, and a few outright hostile. I could see Karen sitting near the front, dressed in her usual sharp tailored outfit, giving off an air of calm authority. But today, there was an edge to her. She was visibly tense, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk, her eyes locked onto me as if she could will me into silence. I set my folder down on the podium, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. For months, Karen had held this community in the palm of her hand, controlling everything from the HOA to the very property rights of its residents. But not anymore. I wasn't going to let her keep controlling the narrative. It was time for the truth. The mayor called the meeting to order, but I didn't waste any time. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall, every inch of my body carrying the anger and frustration that had been building up for months. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady but firm. I stand here today not just as a resident of Millbrook Estates, but as someone who's watched for far too long as one person has used her position to manipulate, control, and destroy the lives of others. And I'm talking about Karen Hawthorne. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The shock was evident on her face, but she quickly masked it with her usual polite smile. I knew what she was thinking. How dare he accuse me of anything? But I was done with the facade. It was time to expose her for who she really was. For months I've been under attack, I continued. First it was the fines, then the fabricated violation reports, and now Karen is trying to seize my property under the guise of public safety. But it's not about safety. It's about power. It's about control. And it's about money. Karen's eyes narrowed. She shot a glance at her lawyer, then back at me. Her grip on her folder tightened, but she didn't say a word. I've got evidence proof of how Karen Hawthorne has been using her position as HOA president to line her pockets with stolen funds. She's been embezzling from this community for years, taking your hard-earned money and funneling it into her own private development schemes. And she's been doing it right under your noses, I said, my voice growing stronger. She's been using our HOA dues to fund projects that directly benefit her. And now she's targeting me because I stand in the way of her personal empire. I could see some of the council members exchanging nervous glances. Others were looking down, clearly uncomfortable with the accusations. But the most telling thing was the growing discomfort on Karen's face. She had no idea I knew the extent of her manipulation, and now it was all coming to light. I'm not just making accusations. I have the records, I said, holding up the stack of documents. I have invoices. I have bank statements. I have proof that Karen has used inflated landscaping contracts, fake legal fees, and bogus maintenance payments to steal from this community. The room went silent, the weight of the evidence hanging in the air like a thick fog. Karen's smile faltered. She stood up, her voice tight. This is ridiculous. None of this is true, she said, trying to maintain control of the room. But I wasn't going to let her talk over me anymore. I have the documents to back up every word I've said, I shot back. Karen, you've been lying to everyone, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. You've been using your position for personal gain, and I've got everything I need to prove it. The room was divided now. Some were still on Karen's side, but there were more and more whispers of doubt. More people were looking at her with suspicion, and I knew she could feel it. Her reign of terror was coming to an end. I've also got a letter from the Department of Justice, I said, pulling another piece of paper from my folder. They've launched a full investigation into the HOA's finances and Karen's activities. They've already started gathering evidence for criminal charges. The council members stiffened. Karen's lawyer was suddenly on his feet, his face flushed with panic. This is preposterous, he spat. These claims are baseless. There's no proof of any wrongdoing. But Karen wasn't speaking now. Her silence spoke volumes. She knew I had her. She knew I had the truth, and I wasn't going to stop until everyone knew what kind of person she really was. Karen Hawthorne has been manipulating the system for far too long, I said, my voice rising. And if we let her continue, she'll destroy everything we've built here. Our community, our homes, our legacy, it all means nothing to her. All that matters is her own greed and power. As I finished speaking, I looked directly at Karen. Her face was ashen now, the veneer of control cracking. She was defeated, but she didn't know it yet. The truth was on the table, and it was too late for her to cover it up. The room was silent for a long moment. The mayor cleared his throat, clearly rattled. We'll take a short recess, he announced, trying to regain some control. This is a lot to process. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. I had done it. I had exposed Karen, but I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The council room was thick with tension as I stood before them, the truth now ready to be laid bare. I had all the proof I needed. Karen, sitting at the front with her usual smug composure, wasn't going to escape this time. I pulled the first piece of evidence from my folder, an invoice from Hawthorne Landscaping, her brother-in-law's company. The total $25,000 for landscaping work. I'm sure you'll agree, $25,000 for landscaping seems a little excessive, don't you think, I said, holding the invoice up for the council to see. Especially when the neighborhood does it for free with volunteers. A murmur rippled through the room. Karen shifted uncomfortably, but I wasn't done. Next, I held up an invoice from Mountain West Advisory, a consulting firm Karen had funneled $30,000 to for legal services. This company doesn't even exist outside of paper, I continued. No consultations, no work, just more of her siphoning HOA funds for her personal gain. The council members began flipping through the documents. I could feel the atmosphere shift as the weight of the evidence hit them. And that's not all, I said, my voice strong now. Look at these ledgers. I pulled out a document showing over 20 payments from the HOA's account directly into Karen's private bank accounts, totaling over $150,000. This is money she's stolen from all of you. While you paid your dues, she lined her pockets. A gasp swept through the room. Karen's face had turned pale, and I saw her grip the armrests, trying to keep her composure. But it gets worse, I added, pulling out the letter from the Department of Justice. The DOJ has launched a full investigation into Karen's actions, including her illegal attempts to destroy my property to build a resort. Fraud, embezzlement, bribery, Karen's gonna answer for this. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lawyer stood up, his face pale, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The truth was out. Karen, I said, addressing her directly, you've been lying to all of us, using your power to manipulate and steal. You'll face the consequences. I'll make sure of it. The room was silent, the weight of the evidence undeniable. The council members looked at each other, and I knew Karen's control over them was slipping fast. I've given you the truth, I said. And now, Karen, you're done. The silence in the room was deafening. Karen's face was a mixture of shock and anger, her perfectly composed exterior cracking as the reality of what was happening sank in. Her lawyer stood up, his hands trembling, but there was nothing he could do now. I had dropped the bomb, and Karen's empire was crumbling around her. The council members, who had once been loyal to her, were now visibly uncomfortable. I saw their eyes dart from the evidence to Karen, their expressions changing from suspicion to realization. They had been blind to her corruption, but now the truth was impossible to ignore. I waited for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle in, then turned to face the council. I've given you everything you need, I said, my voice steady. The proof of Karen's manipulation, the stolen funds, the fraudulent reports. This is not just about my dam anymore. It's about a community that has been misled, taken advantage of, and betrayed. Karen Hawthorne has been using her position to line her pockets at all of your expense. Karen's hands clenched into fists, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her facade. You don't know what you're talking about, she spat, her voice rising. This is all lies. None of this is true. But it was too late. The room was already turning. People began murmuring, talking about what they had seen, what they had suspected. The truth was out, and Karen's lies were no longer enough to cover it up. The mayor, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, his voice tinged with disbelief. This is beyond anything I imagined, he muttered, clearly rattled. He turned to the other council members, and I could see the gears turning in their heads. The majority were now looking at Karen like she was a stranger. I think it's clear what needs to happen here, the mayor said, standing up. We can't ignore these findings. I motion that we vote to remove Karen Hawthorne from her position as HOA president, freeze all financial accounts, and demand a full independent audit of the HOA's finances. The motion was seconded without hesitation. Karen stood there, unable to respond, her face flushed with fury. She opened her mouth to protest, but no one was listening anymore. The council voted, and the result was unanimous. Karen was ousted. The moment the vote was finalized, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The fight wasn't over. There would still be legal battles to come, but this was a victory. A small victory for the community. A victory that said, enough is enough. But Karen wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to go quietly. I'll sue every single one of you for defamation, she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. You can't do this to me. I will destroy all of you. But it didn't matter anymore. The room had already made its decision, and her outburst only solidified her downfall. She had overplayed her hand, and now there was no one left to back her up. I walked out of that council meeting with a sense of relief. But as I drove home, I knew that the fight wasn't over. Karen still had power, and she would stop at nothing to try and take me down. But I was ready for it. The battle had just begun, but I wasn't backing down. The fallout from Karen's removal was swift and intense. The media had a field day with the scandal, and the story spread like wildfire through the town. Karen was exposed as the corrupt, manipulative force she had always been. Her name was tarnished, her credibility shattered. The evidence I had provided was too overwhelming for anyone to deny, and the community began to rally around the truth. In the days that followed, the HOA was placed under temporary suspension. A full audit of its finances was initiated, and it became clear just how deep Karen's corruption ran. Every fraudulent invoice, every false report, every misused penny was exposed for the world to see. Karen's luxurious lifestyle had been funded by the community she had sworn to serve. And now she would pay the price. The DOJ's investigation into Karen's activities began almost immediately. Federal authorities moved swiftly, and it wasn't long before they had uncovered enough evidence to charge her with embezzlement, fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Karen's assets were frozen, and she was facing not only criminal prosecution, but also civil lawsuits from the very people she had deceived and stolen from. The legal battle would be long, but it was clear Karen's time was up. As for me, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The dam that my great-grandfather had built, the legacy he had left for us, was safe. My family's land, which had been under constant attack, was now secure. But it wasn't just the property that mattered, it was the community. The HOA was reformed with new leadership that valued transparency and accountability. Janet Morrison, who had become a vocal opponent of Karen's reign, was elected as the new president. She was committed to cleaning up the mess Karen had left behind and restoring trust within the community. For the first time in a long while, I saw the future of Millbrook Estates in a positive light. The audit revealed just how much damage Karen's theft had caused, but it also set the stage for a fresh start. The community rallied around the idea of rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally and socially. People who had been silent for so long began to speak up, and the corrupt practices that had plagued the HOA were swept away. My aquaculture business, which had been on hold during the chaos, flourished once again. The pond, once a symbol of conflict, became a hub of life and sustainability. The fish thrived, and my organic vegetable operation, which used the natural irrigation from the pond, provided fresh produce to local restaurants and markets. The business was thriving, but more importantly, the community had come together in a way I had never expected. A year later, the Millbrook Safety Coalition, a group that had formed to combat Karen's corruption, hosted the first annual WHED festival, celebrating the resilience of the community and the importance of environmental sustainability. The festival was a huge success, drawing in people from surrounding areas who wanted to learn about watershed management, flood prevention, and how to protect their own communities from the same kind of corruption that had plagued Millbrook Estates. As I walked around the festival talking to neighbors and visitors, I saw a new sense of pride in the community. It wasn't just about surviving the scandal, it was about thriving, and it was about learning from the past. I stood by the newly rebuilt dam, which was now a federally protected historic site. It had been modernized to meet current flood control standards, but it still stood as a testament to my great-grandfather's vision. A plaque had been placed on the dam, reading Samuel Blackwood Dam, built 1924, destroyed 2024, rebuilt 2025. A testament to the enduring wisdom that water always remembers where it belongs. I ran my hand over the smooth stone, feeling the weight of history beneath my fingers. It wasn't just a physical structure, it was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what's right no matter the cost. Rebecca Torres, the environmental lawyer who had helped me through the legal battles, had one last surprise for me. She had arranged for the Army Corps of Engineers to fund the rebuilding of the dam using federal disaster relief grants. The dam would be preserved for future generations, and it would protect Millbrook Estates for the next 500 years. The final piece of justice came when Karen was sentenced. The federal investigation into her corruption had revealed the full extent of her crimes, and she was sentenced to 12 years in prison for embezzlement, fraud, and environmental crimes. She was also required to pay restitution to the community, totaling $8.2 million in damages. Her name was tarnished beyond repair, and the people who had once followed her were left to pick up the pieces. The new dam was a beautiful sight to behold, a perfect blend of history and modern engineering. But the real beauty was in how the community had come together. We weren't just rebuilding infrastructure, we were rebuilding trust, rebuilding the bonds that made us a community in the first place. As I stood by the water, watching the sun set over the dam, I knew we had come through something that had changed us all. Millbrook Estates was stronger now, not because we had fought the battle, but because we had won it together. Some lessons are learned the hard way, but the truth had finally prevailed. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It wasn't about the legal battle or the exposure of Karen's corruption. It was about staying grounded and sticking to the process. The temptation to let anger take control was there, especially when the stakes were so high, but it was following the legal path that made all the difference. Without that, things would have turned out very differently, likely much worse for me, my family, and my community. Standing up for what's right is powerful, but it's vital to do it the right way. It's easy to feel driven by rage, or to think that violence or taking shortcuts will solve things faster. But when I stuck to the facts, the law, and the right channels, I saw how much stronger I was, and how much further it took me. Evidence, process, and patience far outweigh emotional reactions, and that's what ultimately protected my legacy and my neighbors' futures. To anyone facing a similar fight, I'd say, keep your record straight, double-check public filings, know when to call an attorney or involve authorities early on. It's not about winning every battle in the heat of the moment, it's about knowing how to navigate the system when it matters most. In the end, a community thrives when people respect the law. The HOA's power was only as strong as the fear and ignorance it preyed on. When people stand up legally, there's nothing more powerful than that. Just like the dam that had stood for nearly a century, resilient, calm, and unwavering, the true strength lies in acting with patience, not haste. It was the law that saved my home, and in the end, the law that preserved my community's future.